So I'll start. I'm David Durfee. I represent Shaftesbury, Glastonbury, and Sunderland down in Bennington County. And we'll go around the room and just all say hello.
Sure. Hi, I'm Heather Supernaut, Vice Chair. I represent Windsor 4, Barnard, Compton, Bridgewater.
Hi, I'm Esme Cole. I am in Windsor 6 and I represent Hartford.
John O'Brien, I represent Rutland and Tunbridge.
Mike Rice, Bennington, Rutland, Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
Josie Levitt, Grandal Chittenden, all of Grandal County, and a sliver of West Milton.
David Templeman, representing Orleans 3, which includes Barton, Brownington, and Westmore.
Charles Wilson, representing Caledonia 3, Linden, Sheffield, Wheelock, Sutton, and Newark.
Charles.
Henry Pearl, represent Danville, Peacham, and Cabot.
Chet Lipsky, represent Lamoille 1, Stowe.
Rodney Graham, represent Orange 3, which is Williamstown and Chelsea.
And I'm sorry, I failed to say who it was we were introducing ourselves to. So this is Keith Thompson, who's with Forest Parks and Recreation. We're going to continue the conversation that we're going to continue talking about current use or use value appraisal. And last week, I know not everybody was here, but we had Jill Remicken from the tax department just giving us an overview about current use. And there were some specific questions about a new, not sure it's even been implemented yet. We'll be hearing all about a new piece to the use value appraisal program that involves forests. So with that, I will turn it over to you and welcome you and welcome Danny Fitzko, who's also here with us. We've got, just to make sure that everybody knows who everybody is, we have a couple of other guests in the room today. If those of you who are sitting around the sides wouldn't mind just introducing yourselves.
I'm Teo Jagar. I'm an associate with the Craftsman Group, and I was a member of House Agriculture from 2012 to 2016.
And are you representing anybody in particular today?
Forest Partnership.
Forest Partnership. Okay, good. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Carrie Brosnan, and I'm a legislative intern for the NRC.
Great. Nice to have you. All right, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. For the record, my name is Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. I do have forest land enrolled in the current use program. And by way of history, I was a consulting forester for several years, served as the Chittenden County Forester briefly, and around 2015 began this position. I've been in the position since. In my role as a Private Lands Program Manager, I coordinate the county foresters and FPR's role in the administration of the forest land elements of the current use program. In this presentation, get it rolling here. I'm going to introduce the program, some of the program purposes, discuss some of the history, an overview of the program, and then we'll dig into some of the program details, eligibility, obligations, and then I say questions at the end, but I'm more than happy to take them throughout the presentation. This presentation does not focus on the reserve forest land. That's the new subcategory that was created. It takes effect on July 1 of 2023, but I'm more than happy to expand on that, particularly if there are specific questions. So with that, I'll dig right in. So the current use program was established around 1980, and the purpose of the program is to preserve the working landscape and the rural character of Vermont. It's got a number of purposes, keeping Vermont's forest agriculture and forest land in production, protecting natural ecological systems, preventing accelerated conversion to development, and more. During last year's legislative session, the bullet here, protecting natural ecological systems, was elevated to run alongside preserving the working landscape and rural character of Vermont. They're interrelated, and both are necessary to realize the values and the potentials of Vermont's working landscape. The program has grown significantly over time. So again, Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation administers the forest land part of the program. In the program, there are two main enrollment categories: managed forest land and agricultural land. Within managed forest land, there are subcategories. And those subcategories here include conservation, reserve forest land. The new enrollment category is actually a subcategory of managed forest land. And there are more in the program, and we'll touch on each of those. But right now, there are about 2 million acres of forest land enrolled in the program among 16,000 parcels. You can see the trend lines and the growth of the program. It has continued to grow. It has steadied off somewhat in recent years, but hasn't leveled off.
Keith, can I just have you read what the 3 lines represent there?
Sure. So the solid line on the top are the total acres of forest land enrolled in the program. So that's the 2.56 million acres. The middle line, the long dashes, that's the forest land enrollments in the program, 2.01 million acres. The line on the bottom with the smaller dashes, that's agricultural land enrolled in the program. That has somewhat leveled off. And these numbers are taken directly from the Property Valuation Review 2022 annual report that was put out in January.
Representative O'Brien?
Just for some context, Keith, can you tell us like how many acres in Vermont or how many acres of forest land? Just
yes. I've got a slide that shows that in just a moment.
Sorry, Representative Pearl.
Just on the previous slide, I just wondered if you could point out that there's a clear dip between late 80s and early 90s there. Was that an easy out?
That was,
thing, or
there was an easy out. There was also when the program was first created, the enrollments were administered by the towns and there were funding shortages. And so the payments were reduced and there were easy outs. And so there was less than full funding. And after that, folks recognized pretty quickly there needs to be a steady, reliable commitment. It needs to be administered more broadly and consistently on the statewide level. And towns need to get reimbursed for their foregone tax revenue. And so a lot of those changes occurred around that time. So I think that there were actually a lot of structural changes that occurred to help address some of the challenges that were being faced there.
Thanks.
Sure. So I think it's important to look at the growth enrollment over time and how some of the trends deviate from each other. So acres, there's been a 43% increase in the acres enrolled in the program since 2003, but there's been a 70% increase in the number of parcels. And from an administrative standpoint, from a productivity standpoint and working landscape, it's important to understand the reasons. And one of the reasons is that most of the large parcels are already enrolled. It's a really significant benefit. The opportunities that the program presents are really in line with a lot of landowners' objectives, and so it makes sense to enroll. And so smaller parcels have a lower frequency of enrollment, though it's about around 50% if you're at about 50 acres. And so that's the larger pool that can be enrolled, or the larger pool of unenrolled parcels. But the other piece is that parcels that are enrolled can subdivide over time. And if a 100-acre parcel subdivides into 2 50-acre parcels, each of those remains eligible. But now there are 2 parcels instead of 1 with no increase in acreage. I think that's important to consider just from a standpoint of administration, as well as there are some cost implications to that PBR could speak better to than we can, but is worth considering. So to the question about the statewide enrollments, there are, I think, a couple of things to look at here. There's about 4.5 million total acres of forest land. There's about 3.5 million acres of private land. And of that, there's about 2.77 million acres of eligible land. So that's private land that meets, in principle, the eligibility requirements. And so just recently, we've had the statewide mapping in a condition that could allow us to do an analysis of how many eligible parcels might there be. And so being able to evaluate show me all the parcels that are over 25 acres. And of those, they need to have a certain amount of forest land. And of those, which are enrolled and which are not. And so these are, I think, really solid estimates that we've got about 55% of the eligible forest land parcels enrolled in the program. So 16,000 of about 29,000 eligible parcels. And about 70% of eligible forest land acres are enrolled. So that's the 2.1 million of the 2.8 million potentially eligible acres. Any questions on that?
Representative Lipsky.
Keith, the white areas, were those federal forest lands?
Those are,
Go along the spine.
they are public lands. So federal lands in the south largely, state lands in the north, and then throughout, there's kind of a matrix of white area. And those would be largely private lands that are too small to be eligible for enrollment in the program.
Thank you.
Representative Templeman.
This is the second presentation. It's only now about current use, and it's only now that I'm realizing waterways, are they covered in current use, privately owned ponds and such?
So recreational ponds are not eligible. And I believe it's ponds or bodies of water over 10 acres, I believe are not eligible. There's part of me that's nagging and saying 20. And that's why we've got a lengthy standards book about this. But so there are some that are eligible. Certainly areas along streams and rivers and so on are eligible.
I see. Thank you.
Sure.
I see, looking at the number of slides here, that you've got a ways to go. So we'll, if we have questions about what we're looking at that we need to clarify, jump in, but otherwise we'll let you go.
When we think about the program, it's useful to start at the landscape scale and kind of zoom in and think about what are the values that this program provides. And as we drive down the road and we don't see these enrollments, it's helpful to think about how is this a glue that kind of holds some of this management together, these opportunities together? When we zero in on individual towns, some areas, it's almost a seamless network of enrollments. Other areas, as you get smaller parcels and different ownership patterns, it can be a little bit more fragmented. In other areas like the Champlain Valley, in some places, the enrollments can be much more sparse and widely distributed. So as I mentioned before, there are two main enrollment categories: agricultural land and forest land. Conservation land is one that's called out specifically in statute with some specific enrollment criteria. But the main benefit from the program for landowners, or the most direct benefit anyway, is the reduced value on which their land is taxed. And so forest land and agricultural land each have a use value applied to them. They're applied each year. The current use advisory board sets those values. Forest land, 187 acres is the value for forest land. There is a separate value for forest land that's greater than 1 mile from a class 1, 2, or 3 road. This year it's $140 per acre. Agricultural land has a separate value. This year it's $456 per acre. Those values do change over time. In 2013, it was $119 per acre. This year, $187 per acre. We do expect that trend to continue. The savings that landowners realize from this program really depend specifically on the enrollment, the value of their land, so what town they're in, what the conditions are, and so on. And so it's really hard to make a universal statement about what the savings are. But one starting point, we say if the most simple enrollment where the entire property is enrolled and it's all forest land, about 90% savings on taxes is a good starting point. You can see here in this example, 100-acre parcel enrolled in the program is going to be taxed at a value of $18,700 as opposed to fair market value. If it's $1,000 per acre, this same parcel would be taxed at a value of $100,000 per acre. And so the difference between the two is the savings and can be very significant. When we're thinking about what comprises of an enrollment, and we look at that map and there's a bunch of different parcels that are enrolled, each one of those has a mixture of enrollment conditions. Some of those have excluded land, so areas that are not eligible for enrollment. 2 acres around each dwelling, areas along larger power lines, recreational ponds would be an example, lawns, another. So property valuation review really navigates those exclusions. They also handle agricultural land eligibility. I'll just touch on these so it's valuable context, but land that's leased to a farmer that has minimum acreage of 25 acres, meets income requirements for non-farmers, would affect agricultural land eligibility, and property valuation review are the folks who evaluate that and provide the direct guidance on what's eligible and assisting landowners or farmers with that. In 2016, there was a requirement that there be an annual certification for enrollment of agricultural land. And there are some other requirements, including creating a map and things like that in order to be eligible. In addition to the land being eligible, agricultural buildings can be eligible. There are some specific criteria about that. Again, this is navigated by PVR, property valuation review, so I don't want to get out on the limb representing what's really in their bailiwick. But forest land is ours, Forest Parks and Recreation, we administer it, and conservation land is one part of that. I'm going to touch on that briefly. It is a small part of the program. There's about 200 parcels enrolled, about 40,000 acres. It is eligible exclusively for landowners that are 501c3 in the business of conserving land. Land that's enrolled in the conservation land category does need to be certified. The organization needs to be certified as a 501c3, and the parcel itself needs to be certified. Property valuation review helps that. But the parcel does need a management plan. It needs a management plan describing the condition, the conservation values, and that plan needs to be updated on a 10-year cycle. So like I said, that is a small part of the program. It does not necessarily require timber management. That's not precluded from conservation enrollments. But the bulk of the enrollments in the current use program are productive forest land. And productive forest land includes a number of different subcategories. The eligibility criteria for forested parcels are that the parcel needs to have 25 acres of enrolled land with a minimum of 20 acres of productive managed forest. So that's exclusive of house sites or other excluded land. The management on a property that's enrolled in the program is approved by Forest Parks and Recreation. This is management plans describe the management, describe the forest, describe the management that's going to occur on the property, and then it needs to meet certain standards, and county foresters review those plans to determine that standards have been met. We'll get into that in a little bit more. So most of the land does need to be managed for saw timber. There are some exceptions. Lands eligible as ecologically significant treatment areas do not require timber management to be the primary objective. There are some specific criteria for those conditions, and I'll describe those in a bit. In addition, Site 4 lands, that's a broad category that describes land that is not capable of growing trees at a certain rate. So think certain wetlands, mountaintops, things like that. Really valuable ecologically, not places to prioritize timber management. They are eligible without limits when all other eligibility criteria are met. So to touch on the subcategories, so productive forest land is the biggest enrollment category that most forest land is enrolled in. And management on productive forest land needs to meet Forest Service silvicultural guides as described in the forest management plan. Some other subcategories like significant wildlife habitat and special places and sensitive sites may use guidelines. They need to be managed for saw timber, but they can use other guidelines. An example of significant wildlife habitat might include deer wintering areas, something like that, where the opportunity to manage for saw timber is there, but you may not want to, it may be really valuable to incorporate other management objectives and adapt the timber management approach to support those habitat values. As I mentioned, there are some lands that are not actively managed for saw timber. There are a number of categories. The enrollments aren't high. So ecologically significant treatment areas, right now there are about 12,000 acres enrolled as ecologically significant treatment areas compared with the 2.01 million acres of land enrolled. So it's a small acreage. They are really significant places though. The places that are eligible are natural communities of statewide significance, rare, threatened, endangered species, riparian areas, so think areas along streams, vernal pools with amphibian breeding habitat, forested wetlands, and old forests are all eligible to be enrolled as ESTAs.
Keith, are the 12,000 acres, is that what you said?
Yes.
So are they typically located within larger parcels that are managed?
Yes, exclusively. In fact, right now, parcel that can only enroll ESTAs when a portion of the parcel is being managed for saw timber. And there are some narrow criteria for the ESTAs. And so a property that has that is 100% wetland and incapable of growing trees would not be eligible in the forest land category because it does not have 20 acres of forest land being managed for saw timber. If you take that same parcel and it now has those 20 acres, it has achieved the eligibility threshold, and then there's no limit on the amount of wetland that may be enrolled with that productive forest land.
Representative Rice.
How much space, how much space is a riparian buffer or around a vernal pool area is considered the ESTA as opposed to the?
Sure, the vernal pool area is limited to 100 feet. The riparian ESTA is based on where riparian function exists, and that can vary. If you think about a floodplain along a major river, that can extend several hundred feet. If you think about the riparian area within a steeper landscape along a mountain, that riparian area where there's riparian function may be much less, but it really depends on site conditions. And when we were developing standards for the reserve forest land category, we felt it really was important to get a precise width. And so 50 feet on intermittent streams, 100 feet on perennial streams, unless there's a justification for a wider area, can be considered for determining eligibility for reserve forest land.
Representative O'Brien.
Just quickly on jurisdiction, what happens with natural wildlife preserves or town forests? Are they managed? Does FPR recommend they're managed, say, as an ESTA or even as if they're in current use, even though they may not be?
All management is an integration of the landowner's objectives and the potential of the site and the values of the site. And so I think that FPR feels really strongly that the ecological values of, and most frequently we're involved in town forest management, and we will evaluate what the potential of a site is to be managed for various values, including saw timber. And we think that managing for saw timber is an important value. It is not one that outweighs certain ecological values, and figuring out how to strike a compatible use is something that we always want to consider. It's not always achieved. And so there will certainly be places on town forest where we say, this is best managed for its ecological value, and timber management isn't a priority here. Let's consider where else it's an option. There are some town forests where the towns prefer not to manage for saw timber, and they may prioritize other resource values. And we will certainly support them with figuring out how to do that well.
Representative Lipsky?
Keith, one of your bullets in the STAs is old forests.
Yep.
How do you, in your role, describe an old forest? There's been new rhetoric about an 80-year-old tree might be an old forest.
Yes.
What do you consider an old forest?
Old forest is defined. We've got it established by standards. The commissioner adopts certain standards. So I will try to summarize it here, but an old forest is not defined by 80-year-old trees or any individual tree. An old forest is characterized by, it has large trees, that have been allowed to develop naturally. It has canopy gaps. It has the largest trees that are present and growing on site are also represented in snags and coarse woody material. It has canopy gaps. Frequently it's messy. But what an old forest is really variable based on site. The old forest on the top of Mount Mansfield is going to look very, very different than the old forest down on the shores of Lake Champlain. And so we can't make a really succinct definition of it. I actually have a number of publications in my computer bag that I'd be happy to distribute that we've worked on a publication with UVM and University of Massachusetts on restoring old growth characteristics. And I think it's really important for folks to appreciate that we have almost no old growth forest in the state. And we cannot make new old growth, but we can support old forest characteristics, and we can do it in a number of ways. We can do it by stepping back and letting natural processes take their course, and that can be a long, long process. We can also use timber management to support development of old forest characteristics by creating gaps and growing trees faster. And we can sustain those while actively managing for saw timber. We can also develop those and step back once those conditions are restored. There's a lot of ways to do this. And we believe strongly that managing forests for the breadth of conditions that are available, using the breadth of strategies, is critical for realizing the breadth of values and benefits forests can offer. There is no one size fits all. There is no best approach. We need all of it, and we need to figure out how to do it in ways that are compatible and fit with the needs of landowners and the landscape.
Just a follow-up, if I may, David.
Sure, yeah.
And this has to do with, I have read that credible carbon study by UMass and UVM scientists. But my question now is, where does the notion of pioneer forest succession play in old growth? Your abandoned sheep land and the pioneer species, eventually dominated by white pine, are a long way from a typical climax forest.
Absolutely.
So where do pioneer species or old CCC plantation land come in the notion of old forests and composition?
Forests are good at increasing diversity and moving towards more complexity. Oftentimes, forests that are dominated by pioneer species, areas that have reverted from agriculture, are pretty simple systems, one age class, not a lot of structural diversity. They provide a huge amount of value for a certain suite of species. They're critical to have on our landscape. At times, those areas can be managed, continue to be managed for those, and they may not be appropriate to be managed for old forest. But people can manage young forests, pioneer forests, for more complexity. It's never too early to start accruing old forest characteristics. There may be better times and more effective times to manage for certain elements. I think that this is its own body of work and discussion. I'm afraid that if we dig too deeply into this, we may not cover the UVA stuff, but
I don't want to slow us down.
okay. I do love talking about it though.
I know.
We'll schedule you back for more time to go into that a little more depth then, yeah.
I just want to share what an example enrollment might look like. As I said, any individual property may have multiple enrollment subcategories in it. So in this example, there's about 19 acres of productive forest land. Excuse me, I've got that wrong because I'm covering up my acreage chart. Sorry, we've got about 24 acres, just less than 24 acres of productive forest land, broken out into two distinct areas. We've got 4 acres of open agricultural land in the southern part of the parcel. We've got 9 acres of riparian ESTA in this parcel, and then there are 2 acres excluded. So any one of these enrollments can contain a number of different enrollment subcategories, each of which are described in a forest management plan and substantiated with specific management strategies for them. So, as I said, the forest management plan describes the forest. It's generally prepared by a private licensed consulting forester. It describes the long-term management goals for the parcel, describes the stand conditions, so the different forest types and the objectives for each of those areas, and will include a map and schedule of treatments. Plans need to be updated every 10 years, and frequently landowners will sell their property. When a property is sold, the new landowner can adopt that management plan, kind of step into that plan update cycle. So if they purchase a property, the plan is in year 5 of its 10-year cycle, they can carry that plan forward for the remaining 5 years and update it on year 10. When land is enrolled in the program, the parcel management needs to follow the management plan. Landowners need to submit forest management activity reports each year by February 1 for any activity that occurred in the previous year. The properties are inspected annually, repeatedly by county foresters, and that occurs on a cycle. Statute requires that parcels are inspected once every 10 years by the county foresters. I think that there's a lot of discussion about the requirements of the program. Some folks are really excited about managing for saw timber, some less so. The program has a lot of flexibility while it puts working lands at the primary purpose of the program. It's important for folks to appreciate that management for forest products should be aligned with the landowner's goals. Management for recreation, aesthetics, wildlife, and water quality are compatible with timber management. In addition, forest management can have some really beneficial outcomes. Where land use history has altered hydrology, including invasive plants, simplified forest structure, where climate change and other stressors threaten forest health, active management can be a critical tool to fund and implement restoration and climate adaptive silviculture when they are most valuable ecologically. I think that's an important message, that forest management isn't just okay when it doesn't damage the other resources. It can be a critical tool to ensure that the values and ecological health of certain places are sustained. And I think that that's a message that we need to get out more. It's incredibly valuable and really important, a really critical tool for Vermont.
So can I just repeat or paraphrase what I think you were saying, is that in some cases anyway, actively having a forest management plan would be more beneficial ecologically than doing nothing.
Yep. It is possible. And I think that there are some of the values of success can be subjective. But if we're thinking about old forest and diversity and adapting to climate change, and we think about some forests that are CCC era plantations, and it is even aged white pine. And at the time that was planted, that was to stabilize the soil and to put people to work, and it did its job wonderfully. But if we're looking at this forest and we're talking about biodiversity and we're talking about the ability of our forest to respond and regenerate as we get storms and pests and things like that, if the wind blows hard and that whole forest is knocked down, we may be in a poorer position than we would have been if that forest had been managed to introduce native species that are to get younger pioneer species establishing in the understory, or to get a broader diversity of species present. And so it doesn't mean that that's the best way to do it, but it's a really important tool to have on the landscape.
Thank you.
Sure. Each management plan, so there's 16,000 parcels enrolled, each of which has a forest management plan. Our county foresters are reviewing, in the last 5 years, reviewed 10,000 management plans. Each year, we've got 1,600 management plans on average because of the update cycle. In addition, there's new enrollments and amendments and transfers. So there's a high volume of plans that we're reviewing. But for each property or each plan, they've got a property summary, parcel resource information, stand descriptions, management prescriptions, and mapping. Here's an example of what a map might look like. We don't need to get into the details, but there are standards for each map. They need to have a locus map to show where it is on the landscape, an acreage chart to describe eligibility, and they need to show each of the different management units on the property. To stay enrolled, there are certain management standards. Big, really important one among them is making sure that the water quality practices on a property are enrolled or are implemented. And so we're crossing streams appropriately. We are installing water bars so that we aren't eroding our roads and our infrastructure or adding sediment to streams and degrading their value. It also means that we don't do management where management hasn't been approved. So if we've got a ecologically significant treatment area in a high elevation forest, that we're not getting in there unless activity has been approved. On the flip side, if management has been prescribed, this is a working lands program. If management has been prescribed to support the forest products goals of the parcel, then that management needs to be implemented. And so landowners will be accountable to doing the work that they said that they would do in their forest management plan. The inspections that I mentioned previously are one of the ways that we hold folks accountable to that. If roads are not maintained, or there is a discharge, or the management where no management is prescribed and harvesting occurs, the landowner may be removed from the program. So we do an inspection on properties, and the inspections have two major functions. One function is basic to ensure that program standards are being met, folks are implementing their management plan. The other, and most frequently used approach for inspections is that this is an opportunity to talk with the landowner, to connect with them, to hear what they're focusing on, help them see opportunities to pursue that on their property. And if they're enthusiastic about their land, help them connect to it, help them realize those values from the land. If they're carrying some misconceptions about management, about forestry, to help them see alternatives or different ways of looking at things. But if there is a violation on a property, then properties can be removed from enrollment. There are two ways that primary ways that properties are removed from enrollment. There are voluntary withdrawals, in which case, so I'm going to back up briefly that one of the main functions or the main mechanisms for enrollment in the program is that when a property enrolls, a lien is placed on the land. It's a conditional lien. And that lien runs with the parcel. And in order to remove it, the land use change tax needs to be paid. If there's a voluntary withdrawal from the program, a landowner can say, I don't want to receive tax benefits, but I haven't developed the parcel. I want the lien to remain. That's just fine. They can do that. They can also say, you know what, I'm going to build a house here. I'd like to withdraw these 2 acres. Property valuation review with the town will calculate the land use change tax on the areas to be developed, and the landowner will pay that, and the lien will be discharged for those acres. There can be an administrative removal, and if Forest Parks and Recreation submits an adverse inspection report, then property valuation review will assess the land use change tax on the acres that are contrary to the management plan, and the whole parcel will be removed from enrollment for a period of 5 years. Alternatively, if there has been no development, and that's cutting contrary to the management plan is considered in statute development. If there's been no development, but the landowner is not meeting eligibility requirements, like they didn't update their forest management plan, the land can be removed from enrollment. But if they fix that, they get their management plan in, they can reapply. They're not out for a certain number of years. There's not a land use change tax that's due. So the administrative removal can be fixed with it's no small cost to have full taxation for the year that you're disenrolled, but there isn't the land use change tax or the extended removal. So I mentioned briefly that when there's a cut contrary, there's the removal of the entire property for 5 years and land use change tax on the acres cut contrary. There are about 5 or 10 of these per year. It's easy to stay focused on the program itself and the benefits of the program itself, how much landowners are saving, how much land is not being developed. And those are huge, huge benefits. But there are extended benefits that are a little bit harder to point to. But a study that the Forest Service did through the Woodland Owners Survey looked at extended benefits from the use value appraisal program. And this slide shows some of those benefits. So compared to folks who are not enrolled in the program, so it stands to reason, but parcels enrolled in the program are managing their land according to a management plan far and away more often than parcels that are not enrolled in the program. In addition, landowners enrolled in the program have benefited from advice from consulting foresters, from county foresters, from nonprofits and others. So there's a pipeline for communication with landowners when they're enrolled in the program. In addition, landowners who are enrolled in the program are more frequently taking advantage of cost share funds. So opportunities to manage for certain wildlife habitats or restore water quality are taking advantage of opportunities, perhaps because of the advice that they're receiving through the program. In addition, more frequently, landowners enrolled in the program are their property is conserved with an easement. And so it's more likely not just to have the conservation value of the lien, but the permanent conservation from the easement. And in addition, green certification, so like FSI certification, might be an example that landowners enrolled in the program are more likely to take advantage of. It's important to look at this slide, and it's hard to know if it's a cause and effect that because they're enrolled in this program, that they're taking advantage of these other opportunities. It's possible that they're just correlated, that the people who are enrolled in this program are also the same people who are most likely to take advantage of these other opportunities. But because of all the connections and the relationships that are built through enrollment in this program, it's hard to imagine that there aren't multiple benefits that are flowing just from them having the connection with the consulting forester and county foresters and other partners who support this work. I'll conclude with kind of expanding on what I said before. The use value appraisal program supports working landscape and it supports our forest land. It's really important to stress that the working landscape and the values that we get from our forests do not come from any single use of forest land or any single condition. The values we get from our forests come from young forests. They come from actively managed forests. They come from old forests. And so we need to continue to make sure that the program and management on the landscape supports the breadth of conditions and the breadth of uses of our forests so that we can realize the breadth of values that our forests provide.
Thank you. Questions for Keith now? Representative Lipton.
Keith, it was a great presentation, as clear as I've ever heard, very helpful. And you talk about the breadth of values, which many have been in the lexicon of, foresters and logging, harvesting community. The water quality, wildlife, soil sustainability and productivity, recreation, forest products, industry. I'd say in the last 4 years, but now it's really front and center, is the carbon sequestration storage value is now front and center with time of climate change, greenhouse gas challenges, is a new value that's broadly recognized as one of the critical components when either developing a management plan, initiating and following through on that plan. So with that perspective, I'm going back to something you sort of opened your presentation with, and that is reserve use program that is looming. It's not
reserve forest land yet.
Effect until I think July of 2023.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just touch on that and I'm asking this perspective as someone who values the 6 major values of a forest, but have relied on forest productivity for a living for over half a century. What do you project as some of the impacts of reserve use programs?
Sure. So for context, reserve forest land was created as a subcategory of managed forest land. Intentionally, it was part of managed forest land because old forests, we believe, are complementary and compatible with the working landscape. But we also need to acknowledge that there can be a tension between the management approaches for saw timber and the management approaches for old forest at times. The way that the reserve forest land subcategory was constructed, it was constructed to allow some parcels that have on the ground conditions that make their management for values other than saw timber really appropriate, or creates a barrier to timber management, to make those parcels eligible for enrollment. And so the way it's constructed, a parcel that is 100 acres or less than 100 acres, it needs to have 50% of its total area comprised of these ecologically significant conditions or barriers to timber management. So think steep slopes, or think about each of the ESTAs, so riparian areas or natural, significant natural communities. If more than 50% of that parcel is in those conditions in aggregate, then the entire parcel may be eligible for management for old forest. That's not to preclude management for saw timber or to require management for old forest. They're they can manage that land in a way that advances those old forest characteristics if it's enrolled as reserve forest land. But only a certain number of parcels on the landscape are actually going to be eligible. So an estimated 15% of the 29,000 eligible parcels may be eligible for reserve forest land. It's a larger percentage of the acreage. It's about 25% of the total eligible acres may be eligible. So there is if there were maximum enrollment of this enrollment cat in reserve forest land, the program would still be prioritizing working lands and productive forest land as its priority strategy. And I think at its best, reserve forest land will increase management for old forest characteristics. It will help realize the values from old forest. It will also increase the awareness and knowledge of how to manage saw timber in ways that also supports the biodiversity benefits that old forests provide. I think that there's a real cultural benefit to creating this opportunity without taking it out of balance with our real high needs for forest products and sustaining those values. So I think that there will be more lands managed for old forest. I think that there's going to be a broader understanding of how to do that well. I think that there will be some parcels that no longer are being managed for saw timber, but now are offering this other value. But I do not expect that to be to put our state out of balance. I think it may do the opposite.
Are you enrolling land right now in that new subcategory, or does the enrollment not start until?
The enrollment does not start until July 1. So we have released a report that outlines the standards that Commissioner Snyder adopted at the end of December. That report defines the eligibility criteria, how land needs to be managed, things like that. We are currently working on a rollout strategy. And so we're thinking, what resources do foresters need to help evaluate eligibility of parcels? What do landowners need to understand if their property is eligible or if the requirements are appropriate for their property? There is a misconception among some, and this has been frustrating, but maybe not surprising, that the reserve forest land is a do-nothing category. It is not a do-nothing category. These lands need to be accruing old forest characteristics, and at times that's going to require dealing with invasive plants. At times it's going to require dealing with water quality issues from historical challenges. At times it is going to require enhancing structural diversity in the case of even age plantations, things like that. And in order to ensure that land being managed in this way is advancing these characteristics, there are some additional descriptors that are really important to evaluate that haven't been required for in the productive forest land category previously. So we need to know if there are snags. We need to know if there's dead wood on the ground. We need to know how the regeneration is doing. And these are things that are really important to evaluate. How are we doing on our trajectory from the current condition towards old forest characteristics? And so that's going to take some work on the part of landowners and foresters to demonstrate eligibility and to satisfy the requirements of that enrollment category. But I think those who do, when they're eligible, it's going to be a real benefit to the program.
Representative Rice had his hand up.
Yeah. Is there a sense of the 15% of eligible parcels for that are eligible for reserve forest? how many of them are already in this program and would be changing over to reserve versus how many are not in the program?
The majority of them, I don't have the numbers. I'd be happy to share those. It's also modeling. It was modeling that was done last year. I think I'm thinking about 3/4 of the parcels are already enrolled, but I can get some specific numbers and send them your way.
And what does the outreach look like to foresters? Is there a sort of formalized approach to doing that education?
There will be, and we're creating a game plan for that. I think that the outreach to foresters began last year when we did, before we released the report. We had a meeting with, we had about 80 consulting foresters, did a presentation, got their input on the standards, made sure it was working for them. We also have a private lands advisory committee that we meet with quarterly. It's a small group that had put some really focused effort in hearing from us what we're looking for and providing us feedback to make sure things work for them as well. But when we do this work in the rollout, we will certainly have pre-recorded webinars that are repeatedly available. We think it's going to be important to have some trainings in the field. There are elements like coarse woody material, dead wood on the ground needs to be quantified in the plans, and making sure that folks have some methods in their back pocket to do that on the ground and add that the results into a management plan efficiently, so that there's not a lot of back and forth or frustration as they're navigating this new process.
Follow up?
Yeah, sort of a follow-up that came to mind while you were answering that question. Is there, what's the forester workforce look like?
Forester workforce in Vermont is the best in the Northeast. And we've got about 200 consulting foresters, perhaps more. But it's a good question relative to the number of enrollments. 1,600 management plans are due every year. And those only get done if there's the capacity in the consultant base to get those done. I think it goes up and down, and we are seeing some retirements. I don't know exactly where it's landing, but it's worth keeping an eye on for sure.
Representative O'Brien?
This isn't necessarily a current use question, but it comes from that though, like the whole program is both sort of tax policy and land use policy. Whereas to some extent PBR can stay neutral on it, but FPR really can't in some ways. As far as agree, this is good for our forest rights and manage them for working lands and in certain cases for ecological special spots. So I wondered how are your discussions at FPR in that you're sort of your own client, like you're a landowner of all these state lands, forests, our state forest, our parks, our, other state-owned lands like airports, I suppose you manage. Are there discussions about like, this makes sense to use, to use our state lands as working lands, or these are ecologically important places, or these are, just like we would reserve these in the ESTA programs coming up.
Yeah, and I feel like I could speak to that for current use and private lands. I wonder if with Danielle's, she might be able to touch on that with the forest roadmap in the next presentation.
Yep, I'm happy to address that when I get up. I can do it now.
Okay. No, if it's coming, that's great.
I don't know if it's coming up, so let me actually address that now.
Actually, Jay, I think, I'm sorry, I think maybe for two reasons. I'm trying to hold firm to witnesses being at the table. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No,
and also I see that we're running out of time and I want to stay more or less on schedule, but if you wouldn't mind, we can have you start out with that when you get you up at the table. But I think it is a good question. I mean, it's a fundamental question, so I think it
relevant to current use. I think it's clear that there is an instinct that all things forest land and all things private forest land must pass through current use. I don't think that's true. I think that it's an opportunity folks see. It is important to ensure that that the opportunities landowners have and figuring out how some of the opportunities are compatible with current use. But I think that the purpose of current use as a program that supports the working landscape is front and center. And FPR feels strongly that that is a critical aspect of Vermont's landscape and management of its forests. Active management, there are places where not managing actively is really valuable. And figuring out how that fits within current use, I think that, for example, the reserve forest land is a good example of a balance, and tending to the balance intentionally. But it can be subjective, and each individual has their own perspective. And so when we do it, we do not do it in isolation. We're talking with consulting foresters, we're talking with nonprofits, we're talking with advocates and others, and there may be differences of opinion, but I think we work hard to strike the right balance and have things evolve, and our views of what the right balance looks like adapt to emerging needs, challenges, and opportunities.
Close then with maybe a related question, but going back to the graph you showed us at the beginning with the upward sloping line, and I can't remember what it was, 70 or 55% of parcels already enrolled, but many that still aren't.
5% of parcels
are enrolled, and so another 45% aren't. They tend to be smaller, you mentioned. Is it the department's policy to actively encourage more enrollment? And is there a point at which, for whatever reasons, you might say, no, we're about where we think we should be? Does that question not make sense even?
I think it makes sense. I think that we encourage people to enroll when it fits their needs. And I think that there is a mistake that some folks make to say, enroll in the program, but there's not a conversation about what the commitments are and what the responsibilities are. It's really valuable to have folks connect with their land. It's really valuable to have folks be able to afford ownership of their land and have some sustained connection and commitment to that. And that connection can be really well supported through use value appraisal. So when the requirements of the program fit their readiness to meet them and benefits them, then yes, we will absolutely encourage them. We do not do mass advertising about this or try to make the pitch for it. I think it would be nice if we could, at the same time as doing real in-depth training and education about what's required. But I think that folks come to it. There's as you saw, there's certainly a critical mass of Vermonters who are engaged with the program. And some studies suggest that lack of knowledge about the program isn't the primary barrier to enrollment. The primary barrier to enrollment being, I don't need it. I don't want to be subject to certain suite of standards. And some of that has to do with not wanting to cut timber, and some of it has to do with wanting to cut timber in the way that they want. It's a mix of reasons. So I feel like we certainly don't discourage folks. And it's a long way of, an indirect way of answering your question, but.
Thank you. Great. All right, well, thank you for stopping in this afternoon.
Sure.
We know where to find you. And the committee will take a short break here just to stretch and